All right. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome you all today. Hope everyone has enjoyed the summit so far. My name is Maya Tobias, and I am the Manager of Partnerships and Strategic Marketing here at Course Hero. And I'm very excited to welcome you to this session called Inclusive Teaching Strategies You Can Implement This Week, which will be led by Stephanie Malmberg. We really hope this session will inspire everyone here to share ideas with one another. So throughout the session, we encourage you to put questions, comments, and feedback in the chat or the QA box. And Stephanie is leaving a lot of time at the end for questions. So she's going to spend about 25 minutes speaking and then 20 minutes at the end for questions. So definitely don't hold back your questions and thoughts. This session will be recorded, so no worries if you have to leave a little bit early. We'll share the recordings next week. So welcome, Stephanie. I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you so much for having me today. And I can't imagine I'm the only person on this call who just book shopped Priya Parker's book. What an informative and thought-provoking start to today's day of professional learning and collaboration. I do want to go through my, apologies, it's not advancing for me. There we go. I do want to go through my introduction slide because what I include here really tells the story of how I end up in front of you today. And I think that you will see that there are some real synergistic experiences that inform how I approach inclusive teaching. So my research is anchored in critical race theory and critical whiteness studies. And the lens through which I began deconstructing my early classroom experiences were really through this idea of the presence of whiteness in college classrooms. I'm sure many of us in this session today did not learn how to teach necessarily, right? We're content experts who then go on to teach, and depending on your campus, there may be pedagogical and professional development support, but that may not always be the case. And I very much still remember standing in front of that first class I taught, and what I noticed first. This was one of the most racially and ethnically diverse classroom spaces I had ever entered. And everyone's learning was my responsibility. And also that the book that came with the class referenced my space, and we were in the year 2013. So all of that to say that I had my work cut out for me without really knowing what that work was. I also noticed how students responded to one another and to me. Those first teaching experiences that I had really led me to who I would be as a teacher and really helped me identify my own passions, one of which is to help other faculty think differently about what is possible within the context of their classrooms. So when I say something like whiteness is a delimiting construct, you know, what my research did was explain how the whiteness present and inherent in our classroom environments can serve as a delimiting factor in the learning that takes place within them. I liken whiteness almost to an invisible shaper. It shapes educational spaces where sameness and predictable behavior is rewarded, and where difference in many forms, but certainly racial and ethnic difference, is met at least subconsciously as needing remediation, potentially below standard, underprepared, and the many other ways that students of color are explored in the achievement gap literature. Also in the outcomes and retention data that we lament. And I think that this really does a disservice to our students and perpetuates inequities. And really what my work served to do was offer a macro or a structural explanation for the achievement gap. And so I've been teaching in a social justice focused human development and human rights program at Binghamton University since 2015. I was hired as an adjunct lecturer at my local community college in 2013, and then I was off to the R1 in 2015. I teach the 200 level introductory course, and this is the first course required in the program that students must pass with a C prior to taking any other course in the program. In this survey course, I embed many of the concepts that students will explore as they progress through the program. I like to tell them that they're not expected to be experts in anything upon completion of our course, but they have a solid foundation upon which to build. In 2019, I designed the State University of New York Center for Professional Development's DEI certificate program. I was a member of that committee, and I developed a course called Teaching for Racial Equity, which has really become my favorite course to teach. This is marketed to faculty within and beyond the SUNY system and does exactly what I needed when I first started teaching. I recently completed a significant refresh based on the State University of New York's new diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice learning outcome. I also oversee our distance learning and professional development programs at SUNY Broome. In 2020, when everything became distance learning, we quickly realized that we needed somebody to be overseeing these programs. And so that's when I stepped in and up. It's been really a wonderful opportunity, particularly with the professional development part of my job. I oversee our instructional designers in our teaching resource center. Our team conducts accessibility course reviews using SUNY's course quality rubric known as the OSCAR. They also provide campus-wide support for digital content remediation to increase the accessibility of our courses that utilize the learning management system. And this is just among a number of strategic initiatives that we have on our campus that are focused on inclusivity. I'm happy and humbled to announce that I was just awarded the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Adjunct Teaching at Binghamton University, which is one of the system's highest honors for teaching, and certainly one of the few that are awarded to contingent part-time faculty. And my current research focus, something that I'm deeply interested in knowing more about, is how our students of color are experiencing diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice curriculum. As someone who's taught DEISJ concepts for nearly a decade, when I first started, I did not fully understand the impact on students of color having to bear witness to the enlightenment of their peers. I'm deeply motivated to not only demonstrate systemic deprivation of critical resources and its impacts on people and communities of color, or to focus on the oppression that our LGBTQ+ partners are facing throughout the country for just trying to exist, or the experiences of those with hidden disabilities that have to navigate a world that's not necessarily designed for them, but to find some balance, some resistance, some community, and certainly joy in what I present when presenting concepts that are specific to those experiences. And so all of these inputs inform what I'm presenting this morning, and I sincerely appreciate your taking this journey with me. So to begin, I want to say that inclusive teaching is a mindset. We can't just will inclusive classrooms into being. We have to think about how to best create opportunities for all students to connect with us, to also connect with the course material and the concepts under study, and I think maybe most importantly, to connect with each other. It requires demonstrating respect for others, remaining open-minded, bringing an intellectual curiosity into the classroom, demonstrating cultural competence, and almost paramount to all of those is being kind. There's a lot of prep work and active teaching and real-time management that's required in order for this environment to maintain these conditions and in order for them to have the intended impact and not cause harm. The classroom environment, regardless of modality, impacts the learning that takes place as much as the content we teach. Moreover, this does not take just one form. Like us, our students come into our learning spaces with intersectional identities, a range of life experience, and various experiences in the education system, all of which they bring with them when they sit in seats in our classrooms. This requires preparation, agility, and confidence in everything that we do. And when we think about structure, we also need to be thinking about how we prepare students to be successful in our learning environments as part of our inclusive teaching approach. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the principles of universal design for learning. I teach courses that are capped at 48 students, and it is reasonable for me to expect 10 academic accommodation plans for a variety of reasons, an increasing number of which are mental health related. As an outgrowth of the pandemic, I provide a well-structured learning environment for students. And my goal here really is to minimize the questions that students need to ask by providing the syllabus, rubrics, almost every course material I plan to engage with for each week, nestled in its own folder, everything fully captioned, everything fully ADA accessible. Pretty much anything a student would need to take a well-designed, fully online course while also teaching the course in person. And I found that, when students are struggling or a student has missed class and they need to get caught up, or, they're trying to perform their best on quantitative or qualitative assessments, having access to recorded lectures and supporting videos really goes a long way. For the most part in my courses, no student has to ask for anything extra. I've designed it in such a way that it is all there. It also provides access to the learning materials in more than one format. Some of us listen and take notes to learn, right? That's my style. But other folks might find videos helpful to explain topics, or like the ability to re-engage if they miss something important or are struggling with a specific concept. If a student requires the use of an assistive or adaptive software like Read and Write, for example, all of the course files are accessible and they don't need to ask for anything extra. When I make changes, something I would really like to take on this fall, I will update all of my supporting materials and then re-record my lectures and captioning them once again in that process. And while there is some lecturing that still has to happen in my classes, it's more helpful. It's more really helping students make the connections among materials and seeing how they fit together and within the broader framework of what it is that we're studying, as well as how to apply it, right? And I find that that's really a very good use of our time. And as I indicated, the nature of many of the academic accommodation plans I receive indicate a high level of anxiety among students related to having to produce something in a short amount of time in the classroom environment. And so I have stopped cold calling altogether. I am using small group to large group report outs for complex questions, which can take the pressure off of individual students. And my hope is that in working in groups, students can play to each other's strengths and still meet the objectives of the activity, which I will cover in more depth in a few slides. So thinking about students who get left behind by low structure, I have everything, as I indicated, in the LMS. I'm making sure that my anthology ally, it used to be Blackboard Ally, now I'm getting used to saying anthology, that my accessibility score is at least 95. And then beyond that, providing students with a structure of what they should expect, right? Guiding questions that we connect and reflect upon at the beginning and the end of the course meeting, and verifying that we are covering the learning outcomes of the course. All of this adds structure to the learning experience. And I'm also facilitating conversations about hot topics in the world, in the lives of people, and in the lives of the students in our classroom. And when talking about experiences and culture and other potentially sensitive topics, right, you're stewarding these conversations so that they are productive and not causing harm to your students. This involves a fair amount of structure. And a side note I want to add here, a book that I read with faculty on our campus last fall semester, Matthew Kay's Not Light But Fire, How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom. It was an outstanding book about having conversations about race, but moreover, it was a solid inclusive pedagogy book. While it's geared to K through 12 educators, there are a lot of takeaways for structuring classroom activities that the faculty discussion group and I were able to immediately apply in our teaching practices in higher education. So getting comfortable with silence, right? This happens and it can be a really good thing. It usually means that people are thinking. If you find that there's no movement, it is perfectly reasonable to say, you know what, let's come back. Let's get in our small groups and think it through, and then come back to the larger group and have a different conversation. I think as educators, we feel an urge or a pressure to rush and fill the space so it doesn't get awkward. But I think we can miss opportunities to expand upon ideas, to complexify them, and to even challenge them when we don't make space for thinking and grappling. In adding structure to small group discussions, I like to pre-develop a list of questions that are important to answer because I want the conversation to be productive and I want students to dig deep into what we're studying. I do include a last question, which is, what burning questions do you still have after this? Or whether it's the reading, the lecture, the class discussion. And this really gives students an opportunity to think critically about the course material and inform an aspect of the discussion. And oftentimes they bring really interesting interpretations. It also gives me real-time feedback with where students' curiosities are, how they're approaching the materials, and where I need to devote more time in the classroom to covering specific concepts. Anonymous participation sometimes saves me. So I really do appreciate all of the various apps that exist to support this. Most students have access to some smart device that will allow them to participate. If that's a concern, this could be done as a group activity, though there could be less anonymity if approaching it that way. And in the LMS and thinking about online teaching specifically, it can be more of a challenge to incorporate anonymous participation. I have worked with the discussion board settings to facilitate this in an online setting, but it is a little clunky. When I think about self-perceptions that stunt student learning, students receive a lot of messages about their capacities as learners. Some are quite positive, which can be difficult to live up to in a new or more challenging setting. However, some are quite negative, which can impact how a student shows up in your classroom. This can impact how a student participates and how they receive feedback. Students often ask to review their performance on an assignment with a notion of covering what they got wrong, right? Tell me what I got wrong. And I understand that. Many of us teach in programs that are highly competitive, they're grade driven, and that might not be something that we can change, and not even that it's necessary to. But I do try to impress upon students that while they may have received a percentage of questions wrong, there is a percentage that they got right. And I asked them to talk me through the logic as to how they arrived at their correct answers. Often this opportunity to talk those through helps them understand what they got wrong and how they could have approached a question or an assignment differently. When I provide a student with feedback on an assignment that they may have done poorly on, I always try to begin my feedback with something along the lines of, this is a really good start, and then highlight something that was done well prior to going into feedback related to their performance on the assignment, along with very specific instructions as to how to improve performance on future assignments. And I know that Carol Dweck's research is often discussed in this way, and I don't want students to believe that they are their grades. My goal is to provide feedback that leads to continuous improvement, and the growth mindset research really does contribute to how I view that. Connecting with students personally is very important to me. So regardless of the modality that I might be teaching in, an icebreaker discussion board really does go a long way. And I also use this to inform small groups. So in the icebreaker discussion, I ask them to tell me their major, their intended career goal, or at least a general field, and a social justice issue that they're really passionate about. And from there, I use that data to sort them into groups where they have interests and aspirations that are aligned and can work through the course materials through these lenses. How you allow a student to know you is always a fine line, right? There are aspects of my intersectional identity that I'm very comfortable sharing with them. For example, I was a post-traditional community college student at the age of 30 with 3 children when I started my academic journey. And this is important to share, and that it makes me less Dr. or Professor Malmberg and more Malmberg, which is what many students end up addressing me as. And I think that them knowing that piece of me makes me more approachable. I also asked them in this icebreaker what their favorite song was at 14. I think it says a lot about a person. I really love music, so for me, this is really fun. It's a great way for folks to connect. And of course, many undergrads are now citing music that I feel maybe came out last week. But as I introduce research methods in this course, I use the findings of their favorite song to use to teach basic aspects of research, right? So students do giggle when I say that a third of the course cited a Drake song as their favorite song when they were 14, but then I demonstrate that with a scatter plot or a bar chart just to start the introduction to the concepts. And they really pay attention to this because this is their data, they get to own it. Some of my colleagues discuss using one-on-one meetings to facilitate connection, which if there's time to do this effectively, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. When teaching a large lecture course, this may be difficult to do or at least do well. One of the things that I did last academic year was I renamed my office hours to student hours with the goal to make their purpose more clear in hopes that they will be better utilized. And then finally, I am a Frarian at heart and in practice, and I have as much to learn from my students as they do from me. My courses are strengthened at every refresh thanks to their participation, right? What they share with me and ways that they allow themselves to be seen in our shared classroom space. This can also be a fine line, right? No one wants to be a spokesperson for their identity. And I will cover on the next slide one of the ways that I do this in a way that is affirming. So I think I already started to discuss this, but I think that really in the small groups are where the magic happens. And this is where students really connect. I receive feedback from students all the time that tell me that they met their bestie in their HDev 200 group. And the goal of the groups is to develop in-class contributions in a non-threatening, equitable way, where students can hear different interpretations of materials, perhaps have questions answered or clarifications without necessarily needing to ask for additional help. And there are a lot of positive impacts of the group work. I do, for each week, have questions that I want them to prepare answers for, and every small group is expected to contribute to the larger group environment. But the assignments of tasks can be strengths-based. So for example, I'm not the biggest fan of public speaking, but I take meticulous notes. My notes would be the contribution. I'm still sharing and participating and engaging. I just won't be the one speaking when we go back to the large group. Another peer or a few peers who like to do the public speaking part will be the ones that do the report out. Each group will select who is doing what. And I think what I've noticed is as folks warm up, I noticed that some of the more quiet students are volunteering to report out. Not all of them, of course, but growth is often demonstrated through comfort. I also ask very specific questions. I try not to leave too much room for ambiguity in so far as what it is that I'm asking. And I also try to tie this to an assignment, essentially preparing them for what I know is either on the next quiz or asked in the next written assignment. And pre-discussion of topics is something that I've been doing for a few semesters now. And essentially, when I know that we have something that's really intense that we're going to be discussing, I like to provide space for folks to just pre-discuss the topic. I am so sorry. And then prior to class, I'll go through them and I'll see where there's some congruence and where there are differences. And I try to pick out some to use as a class discussion prompt in small or large groups. And something that I think is really important is addressing harm immediately. Almost always unintentional, a harm can be experienced in our classroom environment. A really good example of this, one of the weeks in our course is spent learning about maternal health. We have significant maternal health disparities in our country, and they are along racial lines. In asking students to identify a way that disparities in birth outcomes can be lessened for women and people of color who give birth, I almost inevitably have several folks suggest things that women and people of color who give birth can do differently, or how they need to have access to healthcare. And this has created more than one unintentional harm that I immediately address. So using Serena Williams as an example, who you might know is the greatest of all time, she nearly lost her life due to birth complications and was dismissed when she brought it to her world-class doctor's attention. And I had a Black woman in my course state quite specifically that having access to healthcare that doesn't take into consideration her expertise and her own bodily experience isn't going to help lessen those disparities. Another situation that has happened is when someone uses antiquated language that is now deemed offensive. I find this a lot when covering gender development and sexuality. I do gently correct and state the current term and why the term that is being used may not be appropriate. And while deeply uncomfortable to do at times, it is paramount that we do address harm in real time. Everyone in that classroom's experience is important. I have sat in classrooms where inappropriate language was used. I'm remembering a business course I took where a student relied on a racist trope to make their point and it was not addressed by the instructor. And this changed how I engaged in the course. I was disappointed and frustrated, and I expected better from that instructor. And our students expect us to address harm. Well, seeking examples and designing intentional learning activities that allow students to question the structural nature of power and oppression is clearly easier than some disciplines than others. I do think that we can create curriculum that interrogates the structure in a way that illuminates its impact. I have a colleague who took the Teaching for Racial Equity course with me, who teaches math. And she has embarked on a journey to create assignments that use data sets that demonstrate voter disenfranchisement and gerrymandering as a framework. She's doing a bunch of really other cool stuff too. And she will be presenting with me at a SUNY conference on DEI in the classroom, which we're really excited about. I taught another colleague who teaches in a theater program. He is actually now the department chair, and he's on a quest to reach 50% representation of non-white women and non-binary playwrights in his introductory level course, discussing this with students as part of the history of theater and exclusion. I have another colleague who developed an entire course. It's called Spirituals to Hip Hop, and it covers the rich history of Black and African American music in the United States, which also discusses the appropriation of Black music. And it really is just some very interesting stuff. These are just a few examples. In the last 4 years, I've taught close to 100 faculty members, and each one has done at least one, if not several, really cool and interesting things in their classrooms to question the structure and to be more inclusive of a range of cultural realities. In thinking about using intentional language, this is something that I'm still working on. I have changed all of the he or she references in any of my lecture notes to they. I no longer say things like ladies and gentlemen, it is now friends and folks. And while I do struggle to include my own pronouns when introducing myself, I know that that also comes from a place of privilege. And so in making name tents for us at the start of the semester, I do ask folks to include any pronouns should they be comfortable doing so. Another thing I'm trying to get better at is avoiding violent language. So some really great examples of this. I will shoot you an email. I am under the gun with this deadline, or I am dying to do this. These are all a few easy examples of things that I say far too often. Another example of using intentional language is not referring to things as crazy. Have I had a crazy day? Maybe, but maybe my day was difficult, busy, or hectic. And yet another way to think about this is how we refer to groups of students. For example, I won't refer to folks as minorities. I prefer the term historically minoritized groups because I find that to be more precise. I also prefer person-first language when referring to an aspect of someone's identity. Actually just facilitated a 90-minute workshop on this to our marketing and communications department on campus, who wanted to ensure that they are best representing our students in all publication materials. And then one of the things that I think is so incredibly important about inclusive teaching is providing students the opportunity to engage with, unpack, and reflect on the course materials through the lens of their own experiences and interests. I tell students that I'm assigning materials to you through my own lens, but what I'm really interested in is what these concepts look like through the lens of your own experiences and your cultural ways of knowing. Students really do want to be seen, and so I have a few assignments that I use in various courses that are designed to privilege their voice and experience. I'll just cover one, and it's maybe one of the best. It's the social justice mixtape. So I think I already mentioned that I really love music, and so I really love this assignment. I ask students to use a free music app where they can build a playlist. I ask them to find songs that are meaningful to them through the lens of the course materials. And I give them a few examples and share some exemplar assignments, but honestly, students really run with this. The written portion is a paragraph for each song that explains the connection that they've made to the course concepts. And again, here, students enjoy this a lot, probably not as much as I do, but it really is just a really great way to get people really engaged in their learning and really owning what they're learning. I'm going to skip to the next slide. So there are a number of things that we can do that will help foster a more inclusive classroom environment. There are many ways for us to learn about social privilege and oppression. Some of this might be offered by your campus as professional learning opportunities. Our campus hosts book clubs. Our next book is actually Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond, which is an outstanding read. There are many low to no cost ways to learn more about social issues, such as through Speak Out or Equity Literacy Institute, to name a few. Understanding your own implicit biases and stereotypes. This is, I think, just paramount. Gendered language is one. Another is making assumptions about students based on how they present to you. I've known more than one well-meaning colleague who's made an assumption about a student to later learn that they were completely wrong. And I have a really great recent example of this. I had a student last semester who is in the military and is also a pre-service police officer, and he was taking a human rights course with me. And this course focuses on a number of human rights abuses, both global and domestic, and we really do place an emphasis on police abuses in the United States. I was concerned that someone with his particular background would attempt to dominate the conversation or unnecessarily argue points with his peers because his experiences or values may not align with theirs. Instead, what ended up happening was his particular lens really added to the classroom environment. And while he and his peers often did not agree, how they did it said a lot about their character. What was so interesting to me was how they interacted outside of lecture. They were all so kind to each other. They hung out, right? And they sought each other's perspectives on other topics, which I thought was amazing to see. I find it important to stress that we can't present monolithic representations of anyone's identity. We have students of color in particular who are sitting in our classrooms who have to hear how deprived and oppressed they are. And in doing this, we are assuming that students of color come into our classroom spaces fully racially realized, with an understanding of how the structure is implicated in their experiences. I've learned that that is not always the case and has the potential to cause even more harm. Many families prepare their children of color to work just as hard, if not harder than their peers, show up and do their best, and the same doors will open for them as their counterparts. And I think it's important for us to steward that conversation more effectively with an understanding that there is great variation. Ask your colleagues and peers for their perspective. Do some qualitative assessments of your course. Ask students what worked for them and what didn't. And then finally, with regard to collegiate support, resources like Course Hero, for example, utilize them and build professional development around what they offer. They're a treasure trove of resources, and this conference is just one example of the good work that they do. Thank you so much for listening to me talk probably too long. I very much appreciate each one of you for attending this session with me. And with that, we can get to questions.
All right, we have some great questions in the Q&A box, and we have a few people with their hands raised. So let's start with some questions from the chat. So Mike Wald, how do you get your colleagues to also adopt your inclusive approach, and how much extra work does it involve?
I'll answer the second part first. It's a lot. But what I like to do is try, every time I refresh, try to do as much of it as possible at that time. I have the great fortune of working in a social justice focused department, so it's an easy sell. But as somebody who manages professional development on our campus, where we don't necessarily have a social justice orientation, we do have a coalition of the willing. And we do, I have book clubs, I have lunch and learns, we try to offer folks a lot of opportunity to engage in a way that they're comfortable engaging. I will go to department meetings when the new DEISJ learning outcome was rolled out. I attended a lot of meetings and offered up any of our services in the Teaching Resource Center to help faculty members meaningfully achieve that learning outcome in a way that really prioritizes the learning of all students.
Great, thank you for that. All right, how do you address, I think this is going back to the topic of addressing harm immediately in the classroom. So someone wanted some more just specific examples of how you address those topics immediately. Can you give examples of maybe language you might use or how you would actually go about addressing that? Because it's obviously a kind of difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it causes great anxiety, I think, every time I have to do it, but I also know that it's my responsibility to do. If I hear something, and I'm thinking about a presentation that students did a couple of semesters ago, where they conflated people of color with poverty. I had to step in and kindly, but say, that's one way to look at it, but with everything that we've learned in this course, we know that that's not the case, and we know that the structure's been implicated. And just reminding students of what they know. It's never easy. It's always uncomfortable. But it has to be done, because if a student leaves my course thinking that I didn't care about what they experienced, I've lost that student. I will do what I can and be as so kind in the process that takes place in front of people. If there's something else that I think is important to say, I might call the group in and just talk it through, and then point to what we've learned, right? I point to the curriculum to show them what wasn't appropriately or what wasn't accurately represented. It's nervous, it's nerve-wracking, it's unpleasant. It still needs to be done.
Definitely. Okay, the next question is, in regard to the first person language, have you looked into or talked to people in the disability communities and the issues of first person language? A large majority of disabled people prefer identity first because they are not a person in possession of autism, they are autistic.
Yes, I so much appreciate that, because when I was hosting our marketing and communications folks, we actually got into a really large discussion about that. In my former role, I oversaw our accessibility resources office. And whenever I have a question on something, they are who I go to. They are my experts. And as a parent of a child with autism, I ask him what he prefers when I'm thinking about creating documents or creating like lecture documents or curriculum. I'm going to see what is the current conversation. I do try to refresh things, because I really feel like this is really fast moving. The changes in the last 5 years have been breakneck. And so I try to keep up. I take your point, and I think it's really important.
All right, this is sort of a related one. So this is from someone named Sabrina. Do you ever co-create or provide communication or language guidelines with or for students at the beginning of the semester, so they have sort of a structure or wording to use in the class when they wish to provide alternate opinions and may conflict or different perspective from their peers?
I don't have anything that I provide, but I do know that students come in, at least where I am, students come in, and when they disagree, they do it in a very kind and productive way. One of the things that I do when I disagree with somebody, I'm like, I take your point, right? So I try to model a lot of that as I'm having conversations with students, as we're engaging. I take your point, here's another way to see it. And to really facilitate the dialogue that way. So leading by example, I think, is really important.
That's great. We have about 6 minutes left, and we've got a lot of great questions. So I encourage everyone in the audience to please upvote the questions you're most interested in, so we can make sure to get to those. Okay, I see some upvoted down here. So this is from Leslie. When you design intentional learning activities that allow the student to question the structural nature of power and oppression, how do you address bias also?
It's a really great question. Usually by that point, we have done a lot of deconstructing of our own intersectional identities, and we have identified sites of privilege and sites of loss. And we've gotten to a point of comfort. Something that if I had gone into another one of my assignments that I really love, that I think is really impactful, I'm not necessarily having all of these conversations week one. We're building trust, we're reading, we're learning about how this is discussed in the literature. We're talking about human development and the history of theory and how theory was developed. And through that, we're learning how to critique. And so I think that that's a huge piece of it. I like to, so the module that we do on maternal health, we do in week 6. And I think that that's really where we pick up some steam. We're a 15-week campus. So by week 6, we've kind of set the stage, right? We've modeled by example, we've gone deep into some concepts. And I think at that point, we're really ready to have better discussions. It doesn't mean that they always go great. And I certainly don't want anybody to leave this session thinking all I have to do is do this and it's going to go great. No, it is the most active teaching. You are on from the minute you walk in to the minute you leave. And really, my role, in addition to covering course content, is really facilitating conversations and engagement and growth. Not everybody leaves believing what I believe in, and that's quite all right. That's not the goal of my course, but to get people questioning, I think is outstanding. And part of this question, my student that I discussed in the human rights course, he was amazing because he came in with a lot of preconceived notions and a very specific worldview and left. I remember our last day in class, he was like, "You've really opened up my eyes to a lot of things," right? Did I convince him of anything that he didn't believe or anything that he already believed? Not necessarily, right? But he left feeling like, wow, there's a lot about this world I don't know.
All right, this I think will be a quick one, I hope. So this is from Pia. What was the name of the social justice exercise you mentioned, and where can I find information on it?
So the social justice mixtape, and I actually did an interview with Course Hero a number of years ago. So you might be able to find that in their archives. But if not, my email address is in this slide deck. Feel free to email me. I'd be happy to get you a copy of that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Certainly.
Okay, I've got one more question that got a few votes. So you had a great example of a reflection prompt about Serena Williams, who received unequal treatment despite full access to healthcare. This person, Eleanor, teaches public health and said that some students are learning for the first time that people who look like them are likely to have shorter lifespans or worse health outcomes. Do you have advice or suggestions for activities or framing when introducing health disparities to classrooms with different types of students?
Yes, so Linda Villarosa's work here, she wrote a New York Times bestseller last year, but I've been following her for a couple of years. She wrote a book, Under the Skin. It's absolutely outstanding. And she talks about how her time with, I believe it's Essence magazine, where she was writing to other Black women that they could self-care their way out of what they were experiencing. And I think that that's a really interesting way to approach it. I think that the way that she questions the structure is very effective, but also empowering for Black women at the same time, which I really love. It's one of the reasons why I love her work. And when I present these concepts, I utilize the work of Black scholars. I'm very aware of whose work I'm centering when I'm having these discussions. It's not mine. It's the work of these amazing Black scholars that are providing this information. And Linda Villarosa in particular does it in a very gentle and affirming way.
Well, we are all out of time. Stephanie, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for joining this fantastic session. And thank you again for Stephanie. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you'll stay with us for the rest of the summit.
Thank you so much for having me. This was amazing.